Ancient Greece gave us democracy, philosophy, and timeless art. We picture marble statues and brilliant thinkers debating under the sun. But that shining legacy is only one side of the story. A far more complex and often harsh reality lies just beneath that polished surface. This is an exploration of 25 little-known facts about ancient Greece's dark side. By the end, you will see this foundational civilization in a completely new and unsettling light. What brutal practices were considered normal social policy? How did a society that celebrated freedom rely on systematic terror? We are going to journey into the shadows cast by that brilliant Hellenic light. What does it truly mean when a civilization's greatest achievements are built on a foundation of profound contradiction? The most vulnerable members of this society faced a chilling reality from their very first breath. Across ancient Greece, a practice known as exposure was not a crime, but a common and accepted form of social management. If a newborn was considered a burden to the family or the state, it could be left in a public place or a remote outdoor location. The reasons were often starkly practical. For a poor family, another mouth to feed, especially a daughter who would require a dowry, could mean financial ruin. On a larger scale, city-states like Sparta institutionalized this for what they saw as the strength of the community. There, every newborn was examined by elders. Those deemed weak, sickly, or with any perceived physical imperfection were not permitted to join the Spartan community. The ideal was a population of perfect warriors, and this was their brutal starting line. It is important to understand that this was not done in secret. It was a sanctioned act, a difficult choice woven into the fabric of daily life and survival. While some historical accounts suggest a small number of these infants might have been rescued by strangers, perhaps to be raised as servants or slaves, for the vast majority, the outcome was certain. This was a civilization making conscious, heartbreaking calculations about who was allowed to exist within its walls. The brilliance of Greek philosophy and art somehow coexisted with a quiet, systematic agreement about the disposal of human life that did not fit a very narrow ideal. This system of brutal calculation extended far beyond the family unit into the very foundations of the Spartan state. While the Spartan citizen, the hoplite warrior, is celebrated in legend, his entire way of life was built upon the backs of a terrified and brutally oppressed population known as the helots. These were not typical slaves acquired through trade. The helots were the original inhabitants of the regions of Laconia and Messenia, conquered and enslaved en masse by the Spartans. An entire people became the permanent property of the Spartan state, forced to work the land to feed the warrior class that kept them in chains. Their existence was one of legalized terror. To prevent rebellion, the Spartan government formally declared war on the helot population every single year. This was not a symbolic gesture. This legal fiction gave Spartan citizens, particularly young men, in a secretive force called the Krypteia, a license to use lethal force. These operations were designed to instill constant fear, to cull any helots who showed signs of strength or leadership, and to remind everyone of the absolute power dynamic. The helots lived with the knowledge that at any moment, without cause or trial, they could be targeted. This allowed every Spartan male to dedicate his life from childhood to nothing but military training, freed from farming, crafting, or commerce. The legendary Spartan discipline, the phalanx that could not be broken, was only possible because an entire society lived in a state of sanctioned nightmare just beneath it. The brilliance of Spartan military culture casts a long, dark shadow, one filled with the silent, unending fear of the people who made that culture possible. This secret force, the Krypteia, operated in the deepest shadows of Spartan society. It was a chilling rite of passage, a final exam for young Spartan men who had already endured decades of brutal training. Selected from among the most promising, these youths were sent out into the countryside with nothing but a dagger and a single, horrifying mission. Their target was the helot population, and their objective was not battle but terror. Under the cover of darkness, they would move with absolute stealth, targeting helots who were seen as too strong, too capable, or too proud. This was not random violence, it was a systematic campaign of fear designed to decapitate any potential leadership before it could form. The young Spartans learned to live off the land, to move without sound, and to kill without hesitation. Success in this grim duty was a mark of honor, proving one's worth as a true Spartan citizen, hardened and loyal to the state above all else. The psychological impact was twofold. For the helots, it created an atmosphere of pervasive, inescapable dread, where the cover of night brought not rest, but the possibility of silent, sudden loss. For the Spartan youth, it was the ultimate lesson in detachment and brutality, severing any last shred of empathy for the people whose labor sustained their entire world. The Krypteia was not an aberration, it was a cornerstone of Spartan stability. It transformed the abstract concept of control into a personal, bloody ritual, ensuring that each generation of Spartan leaders carried the memory of having enforced their rule with their own hands. This was how a civilization built on conquest maintained its grip, not just with armies in the daylight, but with whispers and daggers in the dark. The psychological landscape of ancient Greece held other complex and deeply ingrained customs that challenge modern understanding. Among the aristocratic and military elite of city-states like Athens and Thebes, a formalized relationship known as pederasty was not only accepted but often celebrated as a vital part of a young man's education. This was a structured bond between an older male, called the erastes, meaning the lover, and a younger adolescent, the eromenos, or beloved. In theory, this was far more than a personal attachment. It was framed as a sacred mentorship where the older man would guide his younger companion in wisdom, civic virtue, physical training, and the arts of war and politics. The erastes was expected to be a model of excellence, and through this intimate bond, he would shape the character of the next generation of citizens. Yet beneath this idealistic veneer lay a profound and unavoidable power imbalance. The relationship was governed by an intricate set of social rules dictating every public interaction. The younger partner was to show modesty and restraint, never appearing to seek the older man's affections too eagerly. Their behavior in public spaces like the gymnasium was carefully watched and judged. The ultimate goal, as defined by society, was not a lifelong partnership. It was a temporary, formative stage. The young eromenos was always expected to transition out of this role upon reaching full adulthood, to eventually take a wife, start a family, and himself become an eraste to a new youth. This structured cycle was considered essential for transmitting cultural values and forging the political and military bonds that held the elite class together. The complexity of this system forces us to confront a difficult historical truth. What was ceremonially praised as a noble educational path was, in its lived reality, a relationship built on an inequality of age, status, and power. The younger partner's consent was filtered through immense social pressure and the promise of future advancement. While some historical accounts suggest these relationships could involve genuine affection and mutual benefit, the formal structure placed the younger man in a vulnerable position, his personal development intricately tied to a dynamic that modern perspectives would view as deeply problematic. This practice reveals how a society capable of profound philosophical inquiry into ethics and justice could simultaneously normalize a custom where the lines between mentorship, intimacy, and obligation were forever blurred. It stands as a stark reminder that the cultural lens through which we view relationships, power, and consent is not universal, but is shaped by forces that even the most brilliant civilizations can fail to fully examine. Even the most celebrated symbols of Greek unity were arenas of sanctioned brutality. The ancient Olympic Games, remembered today as a pure festival of athleticism and peace, presented a spectacle far more visceral and dangerous than our modern version. While poets and musicians competed, the crowd's thunderous roars were reserved for events where victory was often measured in survival. The most infamous of these was the pancration, a term meaning all power. This was combat stripped to its most primal form. Imagine a brutal fusion of boxing and wrestling, but with almost no rules. Contestants could punch, kick, grapple, and apply joint locks. Strikes to the genitals were prohibited, but nearly every other tactic was permitted, including eye gouging and deliberately breaking an opponent's fingers. The only ways to win were by submission, incapacitation, or, in some cases, when one competitor could no longer continue. Deaths in the pancration were not uncommon, and a fighter who killed his opponent could be declared the victor, his triumph stained by the ultimate cost. This was not sport as we understand it. It was a public display of endurance, pain tolerance, and sheer will, a direct reflection of the martial values that underpinned Greek society. The audience did not wince at the violence, they celebrated it as the ultimate test of a man's spirit. Another event of spectacular danger was the chariot race. Held in the hippodrome, this was not a graceful display of horsemanship but a chaotic, dust-choked melee. Drivers guided light, flimsy chariots pulled by teams of 4 horses at breakneck speeds around tight turns. With no barriers separating the lanes, collisions were constant and catastrophic. The chariots, made of wood and leather, would shatter on impact, hurling drivers and horses into the path of oncoming teams. Safety was non-existent. Drivers wrapped the reins around their waists to better control the team, a technique that became a death sentence if they were thrown, as they would be dragged behind panicked horses. The poet Pindar wrote odes to victorious chariot owners, but the glory belonged to the wealthy patron who funded the team, not the driver who risked his life. These games reveal a cultural truth where the pursuit of eternal glory, of having one's name sung by poets for centuries, outweighed the very real and immediate risk of a broken body or a final, anonymous end in the dust. The olive wreath crown was a symbol of supreme achievement precisely because to earn it, an athlete had to walk a razor's edge between immortal fame and mortal ruin. The pursuit of beauty in ancient Greece could be a deadly endeavor. While philosophers pondered the nature of the ideal form, many women were applying a literal poison to their skin in its name. The most sought-after look was a pale, flawless complexion, a sign that one did not labor under the sun, a marker of elite status and refined leisure. To achieve this, they turned to a substance called cerus, a brilliant white paste made by soaking lead shavings in vinegar. This was the foundation of their daily beauty ritual, carefully smoothed over the face and neck. For a touch of color on the cheeks and lips, a rouge made from red lead or a compound containing mercury was often used. The effect was striking, creating a mask-like porcelain appearance that was the height of fashion. But this beauty came with a terrible, hidden cost. With every application, lead was absorbed directly through the skin. The symptoms of lead poisoning are slow and insidious. It begins with headaches and fatigue, then progresses to more severe neurological effects, including mood swings, cognitive decline, and even episodes of confusion. Physically, the very skin it was meant to beautify would suffer most. Chronic use caused severe scarring, permanent discoloration, and patches of hair loss. Over time, it could damage internal organs and contribute to reproductive issues and premature death. This was not a secret. The toxic nature of these materials was understood on some level, as historical texts occasionally mention the ailments of women who used them. Yet the social pressure to conform to the beauty standard, to display the visible markers of wealth and femininity, was so powerful that generations of women made this Faustian bargain. Their choice reflects a universal, often dark, human truth: the lengths to which individuals will go to fit the ideals of their time, even when the mirror reflects a beauty slowly purchased with their own well-being. Even the sacred spaces of the gods held a complex and controversial commerce. In the bustling port city of Corinth, the great temple of Aphrodite, goddess of love, stood as a powerful landmark. Historical sources like the geographer Strabo famously claimed that 1,000 sacred slaves served at this temple. These individuals were known as hierodules, a term meaning sacred servants. Their existence points to a practice that modern historians intensely debate, often referred to as temple or sacred prostitution. The concept is difficult for us to fully grasp, as it represents a profound blurring of boundaries that our culture keeps separate. For some worshippers, the act of engaging with a hierodule was not seen as a purely commercial or carnal transaction. It was interpreted as a form of direct physical devotion to Aphrodite herself, a ritual offering meant to secure the goddess's favor for fertility, love, or safe voyages. The earnings from these encounters likely flowed into the temple's treasury, funding its operations and adding to its immense wealth, making the temple a major economic force in the city. This intertwining of spiritual belief and financial exchange creates a challenging historical puzzle. The evidence is fragmentary and often written by outsiders, leaving scholars to question the scale and precise nature of the practice. Was it a widespread, formalized ritual or a more limited custom amplified by sensational accounts? What is undeniable is the reality of the hierodules themselves. Whether taken as prisoners of war, sold into service, or dedicated to the temple as children, these individuals occupied a unique and vulnerable social position. They were consecrated to a deity which could grant a certain status, yet they remained unfree, their bodies serving both a divine and a very human economy. This practice forces us to confront a world where the sacred and the profane were not clear opposites, but existed on a tangled continuum. It reveals a religious mindset where the divine was approached not only with prayers and animal sacrifices, but through acts that engage the most intimate aspects of human experience. The legacy of the hierodules is a silent one, their personal stories lost, leaving behind only the difficult questions about devotion, agency, and the price of divine favor in the ancient world. The refined image of men reclining on couches, debating philosophy over wine, is only a fragment of the symposium's story. This all-male drinking party was a cornerstone of Greek social and political life, but its atmosphere was often one of sanctioned excess and potential chaos. The central ritual was the consumption of wine, but not as we know it. Greek wine was thick, syrupy, and incredibly potent. To drink it unmixed with water was considered barbaric and dangerous, yet this rule was frequently broken as the night progressed. The goal for many was not pleasant conversation, but deliberate competitive intoxication, pushing themselves to the very edge of illness. To manage this, slave attendants were a constant, silent presence. Their duties extended far beyond pouring drinks. They were there to clean up the inevitable aftermath, a stark, unspoken reminder of the loss of control that was actively pursued. The entertainment further complicated the scene. While skilled female companions known as hetairai could be engaging conversationalists and musicians, their presence in this exclusive male space was inherently transactional. They navigated a precarious role, providing intellectual and artistic company while remaining vulnerable to the shifting moods of inebriated guests. As the wine flowed, the symposium's veneer of civility could shatter. Philosophical debate could twist into bitter personal insult, playful rivalry into a full-scale brawl among men who were, by day, respected citizens. More darkly, the blurred minds and private setting made the symposium a perfect breeding ground for political conspiracy. Oaths sworn in the heat of the moment or secret plots whispered between cups could reshape the fate of a city-state by morning. This was the symposium's dual nature, a space that could nurture the seeds of democracy and art, while simultaneously unleashing the rawest impulses of a culture that saw no contradiction in celebrating both discipline and abandon under the same roof. The wine-fueled debates of the symposium could decide a city's fate, but the ultimate decisions of war were written in far more permanent ink. When a Greek city fell, especially after a prolonged and costly siege, the concept of mercy was often abandoned in favor of a chillingly standardized formula. For the defeated, the outcomes were brutally binary. Soldiers who had fought to the end could expect execution, a swift and public end meant to eliminate future threats and serve as a grim warning to others. For the non-combatants, the women, children, and elderly, a different but equally devastating fate awaited: mass enslavement. This was not an act of singular cruelty, but a routine economic and military tactic. The surviving population became a commodity, their lives converted into wealth for the victorious army and state. The historian Thucydides provides one of the most stark illustrations of this reality in his account of the Melian dialogue. During the Peloponnesian War, the neutral island of Melos refused to submit to Athenian power. Athenian envoys presented their argument with cold, logical clarity, stating that in the world of empires, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. When Melos finally fell after the siege, the Athenians carried out the standard procedure. They put the adult men to death and sold every woman and child into slavery. Thucydides reports this not with outrage, but as a simple matter of historical fact, which is perhaps the most telling detail of all. This event was not considered a wartime atrocity in its time. It was the expected consequence of defiance. The proceeds from such a sale funded further military campaigns, while the enslaved individuals were dispersed across the Mediterranean, their community erased in a single transactional act. This practice reveals a world where entire populations could be reduced to entries in an account ledger, where the line between military victory and commercial acquisition was virtually non-existent. It forces us to see the glittering achievements of Athenian democracy and culture against the backdrop of a system that viewed human beings, under the right circumstances, as a legitimate form of currency and a tool of political terror. The glittering legacy of Athenian democracy was a flame that burned for a privileged few. For all its revolutionary talk of citizen participation and equality before the law, the system was built on a foundation of profound and deliberate exclusion. The celebrated Athenian assembly, where laws were debated and leaders chosen, was open only to a tiny fraction of the city's total population. To have a voice, you had to be a male, born in Athens to Athenian citizen parents, and you had to have completed your military training. This narrow definition instantly silenced the majority of human beings within the city's walls. All women, regardless of intelligence or social standing, were completely barred from political life. Their domain was the household, and their citizenship status existed only to produce the next generation of male citizens. Then there were the metics, the resident foreigners who were often skilled merchants, artisans, and thinkers. They paid taxes and contributed immensely to the city's cultural and economic life, yet they possessed no political rights whatsoever, and beneath everyone else was the immense, silent engine of the state, the slave population. Historians estimate that at the height of Athenian power, perhaps 1 in 3 people in Attica was enslaved. These individuals had no personal freedom, no legal standing, and certainly no vote. Their labor in the silver mines, workshops, and homes is what physically freed the citizen class to spend their days in the assembly or the law courts. So when we picture that vibrant scene of democracy in action, we must also picture the vast, unseen crowd standing just outside the Phoenix Hill where the assembly met. The crowd of women, foreigners, and enslaved people who built, fed, and sustained the city, but whose voices were never heard in its most sacred debates. This was not an oversight, it was the design. The system's brilliance and its enduring philosophical questions were products of a culture that could not conceive of true universal participation. It forces us to ask a difficult question: can a system be truly revolutionary if its very operation depends on the systematic silence of so many? that celebrated Athenian jury system was a far cry from the calm, reasoned courtrooms we envision today. It was a spectacle of public opinion, a legal theater where the fate of an individual could hinge on the emotions of a massive, untrained crowd. Juries were not small panels of 12, but enormous assemblies of citizens, often numbering in the hundreds, drawn by lot for a single day's service. These men had no formal legal education, no judge to guide them on points of law, and no obligation to deliberate in private. The trial was a direct contest of persuasive speech, where the accused and the accuser had to plead their own cases, often hiring a skilled speechwriter to craft their arguments. The atmosphere was charged and theatrical. Defendants would bring their weeping families before the jury to evoke pity. Speakers would appeal to popular prejudices, flatter the juror's sense of power, or smear an opponent's character with vicious personal attacks. The verdict was a simple majority vote, often cast immediately after the speeches concluded, with no requirement for evidence in the modern sense. This was justice as a public performance, where the skill of an orator could outweigh the facts of a case, and where the line between a lawful decision and a mob's whim was dangerously thin. It was a system built on the radical trust in the common citizen's judgment, yet it was vulnerable to manipulation, demagoguery, and the raw, shifting winds of popular sentiment. This vulnerability to collective emotion found its most formal expression in the bizarre and chilling practice of ostracism. Once a year, the Athenian assembly could hold a special vote, not to elect a leader but to exile one. Any citizen could submit a name, and if a minimum number of votes were cast, the individual who received the most votes was forced to leave Athens for 10 years. There was no trial, no formal charge, and no requirement of wrongdoing. The person ostracized lost no property or citizenship rights, only their physical presence. On the surface, it was a safety valve, a way to prevent the rise of a tyrant by removing a potentially divisive figure before they could seize power. In reality, it became a blunt instrument of political warfare. Rival factions would campaign not on policy, but on convincing enough citizens to scratch a single name onto a piece of broken pottery, the ostracon that gave the practice its name. The victim was often simply the most prominent or successful man of the moment, a casualty of jealousy or strategic maneuvering. The great general and statesman Themistocles, the savior of Athens at the Battle of Salamis, was ultimately ostracized by the very people he had led to victory, a stark lesson in the fickleness of democratic fame. Ostracism transformed a tool designed to protect the democracy into a mechanism for enacting the will of the mob, proving that the power of the people, unchecked by legal safeguards, could be as capricious and devastating as the decree of any single king. It was democracy wielding a surgical knife with the force of a club, cutting out perceived threats with a vote that required no reason and allowed no appeal. The power of the mob could be channeled into a ritual of terrifying precision. In moments of profound crisis, when plague ravaged the city or famine gripped the land, ancient Greek communities turned to a ceremony that transferred their collective fear onto a single, vulnerable person. This was the ritual of the pharmakos, a term that translates to both remedy and poison, capturing its paradoxical nature. Selected from the very edges of society, often a person who was enslaved, a criminal, or someone living with a physical difference, this individual was transformed into a living symbol of the city's pollution and misfortune. The community would gather, and through a series of ceremonial acts, they would project all their suffering onto this human vessel. Historical accounts describe a ritual beating with fig branches and wild plants, a symbolic act of driving out the blight. The pharmakos was then paraded through the city, absorbing the communal miasma with every step before being forcefully expelled beyond the boundaries, cast into the wilderness. In some versions of the ritual, the outcome was even more final. The individual might be led to a cliff or a remote location and killed, their death seen as the ultimate purification sacrifice. To modern eyes, this is a horrifying practice, but within its cultural context, it served a profound psychological and social purpose. It gave a tangible, controllable form to the invisible forces of disease and disaster. By identifying a single source for their suffering and violently removing it, the community felt it had taken decisive action to restore the favor of the gods and cleanse the social order. The pharmakos was both victim and savior, a poisoned offering meant to cure the body politic. This ritual reveals a dark undercurrent in Greek religious thought, where the health of the many could be purchased through the ceremonial suffering of the one deemed most expendable. It shows us how a society celebrated for its rationality could, when gripped by primal fear, revert to a logic of symbolic substitution, seeking to cure collective trauma through a performance of exclusion and violence that was, for them, a sacred and necessary medicine. A woman's entire existence was defined by a single, unbroken chain of male authority. From the moment of her birth in most Greek city-states, a woman lived under the legal guardianship of a kyrios. This was not a protector in the modern sense, but a legal controller, a man who held absolute authority over her life's major decisions. First, her father served as her kyrios, and his power over her was most starkly demonstrated in the arrangement of her marriage. Marriage was not a union of two individuals, but a formal transaction between two men. The father would pledge his daughter to a husband in a ceremony called the eng, a word that literally means a pledge or a guarantee. This was a binding contract where the woman was the object being transferred, along with a dowry, from one man's household to another's. Upon marriage, the chain of control simply shifted links. The husband became her new kyrios, taking on the legal responsibility for her. This status rendered a woman a perpetual legal minor, regardless of her age or wisdom. She could not own property in her own name beyond small personal items. Any significant wealth she brought into the marriage, her dowry, was managed by her husband, though it technically remained tied to her birth family to be passed to her sons. She could not initiate a divorce. Only her kyrios could seek to dissolve the marriage on her behalf. Engaging in commerce, signing contracts, or appearing as a full person in a court of law were all beyond her legal capacity. Her primary civic duty was to produce legitimate citizen sons for the state, a role so vital it was her only path to any form of social recognition. This system ensured that the political and economic world of the polis, the city-state, remained an exclusively male domain, its stability built upon the silent, legally invisible labor and lineage of the women within its walls. It was a world where a woman's identity was always relational, defined not by who she was, but by which man held her pledge. The walls of a respectable Athenian home were not merely boundaries of privacy, they were a map of a rigidly divided world. For a citizen's wife or daughter, life was largely confined to a specific area known as the Dionysian. This was not simply a bedroom or a sitting area, it was a separate, inward-facing quarter of the house, often located on an upper floor or in the rear, farthest from the street and the main entrance. Its architecture was a physical manifestation of social rules, designed to shield women from the gaze of unrelated men and to keep them within the domestic sphere. Within these walls, a woman's existence revolved around the essential labor of the household. Her days were filled with the management of enslaved servants, the spinning and weaving of wool into cloth for the entire family, the supervision of food storage and preparation, and the care of young children. This work was vital, the economic engine of the oikos or household, yet it was performed in near invisibility, away from the public eye. Her freedom to leave this domestic realm was severely limited. Venturing out alone was considered improper and potentially dangerous to the family's honor. Exceptions were made for certain religious duties, as women played crucial roles in festivals dedicated to goddesses like Demeter and Athena. These sacred occasions provided a rare and sanctioned escape, a temporary passport into the wider community where they could participate in public rituals alongside other women. But these moments of collective freedom only highlighted the normal constraint. While her husband or father walked the open streets to the agora for commerce, to the assembly for debate, or to the gymnasium for exercise, her world was defined by the interior spaces of the home. This created a profound dichotomy. The vibrant, noisy, political life of the city existed just beyond her doorstep, a world she could hear but seldom fully join. The Dionysium was both a sanctuary and a cage, a space that protected a woman's respectability while systematically isolating her from the civic identity that defined a full human being in the ancient Greek mind. The rigid walls of the domestic sphere could not contain every spiritual impulse. For those seeking a more visceral, ecstatic connection to the divine, there existed a powerful and deeply subversive alternative, the cult of Dionysus. This was not a religion of quiet prayer in a sunlit temple. Dionysus, the god of wine, fertility, and theater, offered his followers a path of liberation through ritual madness, a temporary escape from the strictures of the self and society. His worshippers, predominantly women known as maenads, would leave their homes and families to gather on remote mountainsides under the cloak of night. Through a potent combination of rhythmic drumming, frenzied dancing, and the consumption of wine, they sought to enter a state of ecstatic trance, a mania where they believed they became one with the god himself. In this altered state, they were said to possess superhuman strength and a deep, primal connection to nature. The rituals could turn violent, with myths describing the maenads tearing live animals apart with their bare hands in a sacred act known as sparagmos, the rending. This was not seen as mere slaughter, but as a direct communion with the raw, untamed life force that Dionysus represented. The god's power was both creative and terrifyingly destructive, a duality captured perfectly in one of the most famous Greek tragedies, Euripides' The Bacchae. In the play, the young king Pentheus foolishly attempts to suppress the Dionysian rites, denying the god's power. As punishment, Dionysus drives Pentheus's own mother, Agave, and the other women of Thebes into a frenzied state. Mistaking the disguised Pentheus for a mountain lion, the maenads, led by his mother, perform the sparagmos upon him. Agave returns to the city cradling her son's head, believing it to be the prize from a successful hunt, only to slowly realize the horrific truth. The play serves as a stark warning about the dangers of repressing the irrational, chaotic forces within both human nature and the cosmos. The cult of Dionysus revealed a profound cultural anxiety. It acknowledged that beneath the polished surface of reason, law, and civic order lay a deep, wild well of emotion and instinct that could not be permanently walled away. The state-sanctioned release of this energy in controlled, ritualized settings may have been a necessary safety valve, a way to channel those dangerous energies into a sacred performance, thereby preventing them from shattering the social order itself. To participate was to dance on the very edge of chaos, to touch a power that could grant transcendence one moment and unleash utter devastation the next. But the most famous voice of the gods was not immune to earthly corruption. The oracle at Delphi, where the Pythia breathed sacred vapors to channel Apollo, was far more than a spiritual beacon. It was a geopolitical powerhouse, and its famously ambiguous prophecies were a tool wielded by a sophisticated network of human interests. After the Pythia delivered her cryptic verses in a state of divine possession, her words passed to the priests of Apollo, known as the Hosioi, the Holy Ones. These men were the interpreters, translating the gods' riddles into the political language of the day. Their role was crucial, for a prophecy's meaning could decide the fate of empires. This system of interpretation created a perfect opening for influence. The sanctuary itself was overseen by the Amphictyonic Council, a league of representatives from major Greek regions. This council controlled the temple's vast wealth, collected from offerings and the consultation fees paid by every supplicant, from humble farmers to powerful kings. With so much power and money at stake, the oracle's neutrality was constantly under pressure. City-states like Sparta and Athens, locked in their perpetual struggle, understood this all too well. They would send lavish gifts not just as piety but as strategic investments, a well-timed donation could ensure a more favorable hearing or a prophecy worded to support a military campaign or undermine a rival. The most famous example of this manipulation involves the rich kingdom of Lydia. When King Croesus asked the oracle if he should attack the Persian Empire, he received the legendary response that if he crossed the river Halys, he would destroy a great empire. Emboldened, Croesus attacked, only to be decisively defeated. The great empire destroyed was his own. The oracle's answer was technically true, but its delivery was a masterpiece of deadly ambiguity, perhaps shaped by the knowledge that Persia was also a generous benefactor. This was the dark genius of Delphi. Its prophecies were never wrong because they were crafted to be unfalsifiable, a divine language flexible enough to accommodate the victor's narrative after the fact. The trembling voice of the Pythia may have come from the gods, but the message that reached the world was carefully filtered through the ambitions, alliances, and gold of men. Even the most celebrated artifact of ancient genius might have served a shadowy master. The Antiquity mechanism, recovered from a Roman-era shipwreck over a century ago, is rightly hailed as the world's first analog computer. Its intricate bronze gears, precisely calibrated to model the motions of the sun, moon, and planets, represent a pinnacle of scientific thought centuries ahead of its time. We marvel at its ability to predict eclipses and track the cycles of the Olympic Games, seeing it as a pure instrument of celestial observation. Yet this very precision opens a door to a more complex possibility. In the ancient worldview, astronomy and astrology were inseparable. The movement of the heavens dictated the rhythms of human fate. Scholars examining the device's functions note it could pinpoint the exact dates of significant celestial events, like the risings and settings of specific stars or the phases of the moon, with extraordinary accuracy. This information was not merely academic, it was the essential data for constructing astrological charts. A state official consulting the mechanism could, in theory, determine which days were considered auspicious or inauspicious for launching a military campaign, signing a treaty, or crowning a new leader. The line between calculating a planetary position and forecasting fortune was vanishingly thin. Furthermore, the mechanism's ability to track cycles linked to agricultural and religious calendars suggests another, deeper layer. Some researchers speculated could have been used to schedule rituals dedicated to the chthonic deities, the gods of the earth and the underworld like Persephone or Hades. These were not the luminous Olympians of poetry, but figures associated with the mysteries of death, rebirth, and the fertile, dark soil. Ceremonies for such powers were often conducted at specific, secret times away from public view and required exact timing to be effective. The mechanism's genius, therefore, might not have been purely about understanding the cosmos for knowledge's sake. It could have been a tool for navigating a world where science and the occult were woven into the same fabric, where the cold logic of gears served to illuminate the most uncertain and fearful aspects of human existence, from the fate of empires to the favor of the gods below. The godlike conqueror who fused East and West met his end not on a battlefield, but in a bedchamber thick with suspicion. Alexander the Great's death in Babylon in June of 323 BC is one of history's great unsolved mysteries, and the darkness surrounding it is a direct product of the treacherous world he himself forged. After a sudden, severe illness following a prolonged banquet, the 32-year-old king was gone, leaving a vacuum that would tear his empire apart. The official account pointed to a fever, possibly typhoid or malaria, exacerbated by old battle wounds and a legendary capacity for drink that had taken a final toll. Yet in the tense, paranoid atmosphere of his own court, this explanation satisfied almost no one. A far more sinister theory took root immediately: that Alexander had been poisoned. Suspicion fell heavily on his senior general and regent in Macedonia, Antipater, and his sons. The proposed method was as chilling as the plot itself: wine laced with white hellebore, a toxic plant, or perhaps water from the mythical river Styx, said to be so corrosive it could only be stored in a horse's hoof. The logistics of such an assassination, requiring a conspirator with access to the king's inner circle, seemed entirely plausible. Alexander's reign had been a masterclass in merging cultures, but it was also a crucible of ruthless ambition and fear. He had executed close friends and generals on suspicions of treason, creating a court where loyalty was fragile and the reward for success was often jealousy. His deathbed scene, as later historians described it, became a theater of dread. When asked to whom he left his empire, his alleged reply was simply, "to the strongest." It was less a bequest and more a curse, a prophecy of the bloody wars of succession that would erupt the moment his last breath faded. Whether by natural causes or a murderer's hand, Alexander's passing was the catalyst that unleashed the very chaos his towering presence had temporarily held at bay. The mystery endures because it reflects the essential nature of his rule, a brilliant, unstable fusion of cultures held together by the force of a single mortal will, where the line between a god-king and a vulnerable man was ultimately erased by a fever, a poison, or the poisoned politics he could no longer control. Alexander's fractured empire became a playground for new powers, and none watched the Greek world with more wary fascination than the rising Roman Republic. They absorbed Greek art, philosophy, and gods, but one imported spiritual practice crossed a line, triggering a panic that revealed Rome's deepest fears. In the year 186 before Common Era, the Roman Senate uncovered what it believed was a vast and sinister conspiracy centered on the cult of Bacchus, the Roman name for Dionysus. This was not a new religion, it was a Greek mystery cult that had migrated to Italy, but in the secretive shadows of Roman society, it had transformed into something the state found utterly terrifying. The Senate's investigation, recorded in a surviving decree, alleged a network of nocturnal rites that served as a cover for every imaginable crime. They spoke of initiations shrouded in darkness, where sacred oaths were twisted into bonds of silence for activities ranging from fraud and forgery to a far more alarming accusation, the widespread poisoning of individuals. The state's narrative painted a picture of a counter-society operating within its very heart, one that inverted Roman values of order, family, and public transparency. The cult's mixing of men and women in secret gatherings was interpreted not as religious ecstasy, but as systematic moral corruption. The Senate acted with a severity reserved for existential threats. A special judicial commission was established and a wave of arrests swept across Italy. The crackdown was merciless. Historians of the time report that thousands were implicated. Many of the accused took their own lives while in custody. Those found guilty faced execution, with the Roman state distinguishing between mere participants, who might be imprisoned, and the priests and organizers who were put to death. The Senate ordered the destruction of Bacchic shrines and banned the cult's gatherings unless specifically approved by the state, effectively bringing the wild, ecstatic worship of Dionysus under the cold control of the Roman government. This was more than a religious purge, it was a brutal lesson in social control. The Bacchanalia affair demonstrates how the very qualities that made Greek mystery cults appealing, their promise of personal transcendence and liberation from social norms, were precisely what made them so threatening to a rigid, militaristic state like Rome. The perceived darkness was not in the rituals themselves, but in their secrecy, their potential to create allegiances that bypassed the family and the state. Rome could admire Greek statues and study Greek philosophy, but it would not tolerate a spiritual power it could not regulate, a lesson written in the blood of thousands who dared to seek the gods' favor outside the official channels of an increasingly watchful and fearful empire. The Spartan military machine was not born on the battlefield, but in a state-run institution designed to break and rebuild the human spirit from childhood. This was the agoge, a mandatory education system so severe its founder, Lycurgus, was said to have consulted the Delphic oracle to justify its harshness. At the age of 7, every Spartan boy was taken from his family and placed into a communal barracks, his childhood officially over. The goal was unambiguous: to systematically erase his individual identity and mold him into a single, interchangeable component of the Spartan phalanx, a soldier who valued the state above his own life, family, or comfort. The training was relentless and intentionally brutal. Academic learning was minimal, focused only on martial songs, stories of heroism, and terse speech. The real curriculum was hardship. Boys were given only one cloak for the entire year, summer and winter, to inure them to the elements. They were deliberately underfed, not out of scarcity but as policy. The state wanted them to learn cunning and resourcefulness, to supplement their meager rations by stealing food. Yet this, too, was a trap. If a boy was caught stealing, he was not punished for the theft itself, but for the failure of being caught, resulting in a severe beating. This taught a chilling lesson that success justified any action and failure was the only true crime. Physical competitions were less about sport and more about cultivating a capacity for violence. Older boys and instructors encouraged ferocious fights, believing that enduring pain without complaint was the highest virtue. The infamous ritual of the Diamastagosis, held at the altar of Artemis Orthia, saw boys whipped, sometimes to the point of collapse, as they competed to see who could endure the most pain without crying out. This was not seen as cruelty, but as a sacred test of endurance. The entire system was a calculated psychological forge. Friendship was redirected into a bond of military brotherhood, loyalty was transferred entirely to the state, and compassion was viewed as a dangerous weakness. By the time a Spartan male reached adulthood, the process was complete. The boy who had been taken from his home was gone, replaced by a hoplite for whom the concepts of fear, individuality, and personal desire had been literally beaten out of him. His mind and body belonged to Sparta, a perfect instrument of war, but at a cost that forces us to question the very definition of strength. Political murder in the ancient world was an art of shadows and subtlety. While open combat decided the fate of armies, the fates of kings and generals were often sealed by far quieter means, tools designed not for glory but for deniability. The most infamous of these silent weapons was poison, and its delivery could be diabolically ingenious. One method involved a poisoned ring, a seemingly innocuous piece of jewelry worn by a trusted attendant or even the target himself. A hollow compartment or a tiny, concealed spike could be coated with a toxic substance, allowing for an administration that looked like a simple touch or an accidental scratch during a crowded ceremony. Another brutal technique was the envenomed blade. Daggers were not merely sharpened, they were deliberately contaminated. An assassin might smear the metal with decomposing animal matter or dip it into a concoction made from venomous creatures. Even a non-lethal wound from such a weapon could lead to a slow, agonizing death from infection or systemic poisoning, with the initial attack appearing survivable, masking the true intent. Among the botanical arsenal, hemlock was the most feared. While we remember it from the very public, state-ordered death of Socrates, who drank a cup of the poison as his sentence, its use was not always so theatrical. In smaller, carefully measured doses, hemlock could induce a gradual paralysis and respiratory failure that might be mistaken for a sudden, natural illness. This ambiguity made it a perfect tool for discreet elimination. These methods cast a long shadow of suspicion over some of history's most pivotal moments. Consider the assassination of Philip II of Macedon, Alexander's father. He was cut down by a bodyguard during his daughter's wedding procession, a very public stabbing. Yet, ancient historians like Diodorus and Justin hint at a deeper conspiracy, suggesting the assassin, Pausanias, may have been part of a wider plot involving foreign enemies and even members of Philip's own court. While the weapon was a dagger, the true weapon may have been the political betrayal that placed the killer in that position of trust. The silent weapons of assassination reveal a world where power was defended not only by armies, but by a constant, low-grade war of paranoia, where a handshake, a sip of wine, or the slip of a ring could be the last act of a carefully orchestrated plot. The silent fears and private hatreds of ancient life found a permanent voice in sheets of lead. Across the Greek world, from the bustling markets of Athens to the quiet villages of Sicily, individuals turned to a shadowy form of magic known as binding curses or kataismoi. When public justice seemed uncertain, when a rival in love or business gained an unbearable advantage, or when a courtroom opponent threatened to win a devastating case, people sought a more direct and supernatural intervention. They would take a thin sheet of lead, the common and malleable metal of everyday life, and inscribe upon it a message of pure malice. The words were often scratched in a spiral or a grid, binding the target's name, their faculties, and their fortunes. A merchant might curse a competitor's tongue, rendering him unable to speak persuasively to customers. A lover could target a romantic rival, aiming to freeze their limbs and make them unattractive. An athlete might bind the speed and strength of his opponents before a major competition. The language was direct and vicious, a permanent record of envy, hatred, and profound fear. But writing the curse was only the first step. To activate it, the tablet had to be delivered to the gods below. The cursor would roll or fold the lead sheet, sometimes piercing it with a nail to symbolically bind the victim, and then deposit it in a place that bridged the world of the living and the dead. Graves were a favored location, as the spirits of the departed were thought to carry the plea to the chthonic deities, the gods of the underworld like Hermes or Persephone. Wells, springs, and the sanctuaries of certain gods associated with the earth also served as portals for these dark messages. This practice reveals a parallel spiritual universe operating just beneath the surface of civic religion. While public ceremonies honored the Olympian gods for the health of the state, private individuals were negotiating with the darker powers of the earth to settle personal scores. The sheer number of kataismoi discovered by archaeologists tells us this was not a fringe activity, but a widespread and accepted outlet for human bitterness. It was a form of psychological warfare, a way to exert control in a chaotic world by ritually handing one's anxieties over to the unseen forces below, hoping they would tip the scales in the caster's favor. The silent curses buried in the earth spoke of private desperation, but a city's final defiance could echo for centuries in the historical record. During the relentless expansion of the Persian Empire under its king, a Greek-influenced city in the region of Lycia faced an impossible choice. Xanthos, a proud and independent community, found itself surrounded by the overwhelming forces of the Persians. The historical accounts passed down by Greek writers describe a scene of profound and collective resolve. Confronted with the certainty of conquest, enslavement, and the erasure of their way of life, the citizens of Xanthos made a decision that seems almost incomprehensible today. They gathered everything they held dear, their families, their possessions, and their most sacred treasures, and withdrew to the fortified heart of the city, the Acropolis. There they did not prepare for a last stand with weapons. Instead, they set their entire world ablaze. The fire they ignited consumed not only their homes and temples, but according to the ancient sources, the population itself, choosing a collective end over submission. This event stands as one of the most extreme examples of a practice known to the ancient world, a ritualized self-destruction called anastasis, or raising up, a term that chillingly frames total annihilation as a form of ultimate liberation. To modern sensibilities, this is an act of profound tragedy, yet within its historical context, it was viewed as the ultimate expression of autonomy. For the people of Xanthos, their freedom and identity were non-negotiable commodities. Surrender meant losing both in a life of servitude, while this fiery conclusion meant they controlled the final narrative. It was a statement written in smoke and ash, declaring that some values were worth more than survival itself. the story forces us to grapple with a mindset where community honor and liberty were so deeply woven into the soul that their loss was considered a fate literally worse than death. It reveals the terrifying lengths to which a cornered civilization might go to avoid becoming merely a footnote in the history of its conquerors, choosing instead a final, devastating act of self-determination that would ensure their memory, however haunting, would never be forgotten. The myth of the Minotaur is far more than a simple monster story. It is a haunting parable of state-sanctioned terror, a memory of geopolitical dread fossilized into legend. The powerful King Minos of Crete ruled a thalassocracy, a maritime empire that dominated the Aegean Sea. According to the myth, after his son was killed in Athens, Minos imposed a gruesome penalty on the defeated city. Every 9 years, or in some versions every single year, Athens was forced to send 7 young men and 7 young women as tribute. These youths were not sent to become servants or slaves in the traditional sense. They were delivered into the heart of a vast, incomprehensible maze, the labyrinth, built by the genius Daedalus. Inside waited the Minotaur, a monstrous hybrid of man and bull who would hunt and consume them. There was no trial, no battle, only a slow, terrifying walk into an architectural trap from which there was no return. This narrative captures the essence of a subjugated people's deepest fears. The labyrinth is the perfect metaphor for the inescapable machinery of a tyrannical state. Its winding, identical corridors represent a system designed to confuse and disorient, a bureaucratic and military power so vast that an individual cannot comprehend its logic, only suffer its outcome. The Minotaur at its center is not just a beast, it is the consuming hunger of that state for human tribute, the ritualized violence it demands to maintain its dominance and remind its subjects of their powerlessness. For Athens, forced to surrender its children, the story encoded the trauma of being a vassal to a superior naval power. The tribute was a form of human sacrifice, a recurring payment to appease the monstrous appetite of a distant king. The hero Theseus's eventual slaying of the Minotaur with the help of Ariadne's thread is the fantasy of liberation, of using cunning to navigate and finally destroy the very engine of terror. But the myth's enduring power lies in its first half, in the image of the ship with black sails arriving at Crete, and the 14 Athenians walking into the dark mouth of the maze. It is a collective nightmare about being utterly consumed by a power that offers no reason, only the certainty of a dark and labyrinthine end. Even the strongest walls could not keep out an invisible enemy. In the second year of the Peloponnesian War, a devastating illness arrived in the port of Athens, brought by ships from foreign lands. The historian Thucydides, who survived the outbreak himself, left a chillingly clinical account of its horrific progression. It began with a sudden, intense fever and inflammation of the eyes and throat. A painful cough would follow, then violent stomach ailments. The skin would break out in small pustules and ulcers. But the most terrifying symptom was an unquenchable thirst, so severe that sufferers would throw themselves into public cisterns, seeking any relief from the burning inside. The disease respected no one, striking down the strong and healthy with as much fury as the weak, defying every known treatment and prayer. Yet the true tragedy was not just the physical suffering, but the swift and total collapse of the society it infected. As death became commonplace, the bonds of custom and law dissolved. Fear of contagion overrode all familial duty. Thucydides describes scenes where those who tried to care for the sick would inevitably succumb themselves, leading to a desperate abandonment. The sacred spaces of the city, its temples and shrines, became makeshift resting places for the departed, as traditional burial rites became impossible to perform. With no understanding of how the plague spread, a paralyzing fatalism took hold. People saw that the pious and the wicked died alike, leading many to conclude that the gods had abandoned them or that there was no divine justice at all. This erosion of belief had a direct and terrifying consequence, a descent into open lawlessness. If life was so cheap and death so random, why follow any rules? A new and ruthless self-interest became the only logic. Men pursued immediate pleasure and personal gain, believing they might not live to see a tomorrow where their debts or crimes would come due. The very fabric of Athenian civilization, its respect for the gods, its adherence to law, and its sense of communal duty unraveled in a matter of months. The plague revealed a profound and unsettling truth about human societies. The structures of civilization, the customs and laws that seem so permanent, are in fact a fragile layer, a thin veneer that can be stripped away by overwhelming fear and suffering. It showed that the darkness was not always something that came from outside the city gates, but something that could fester within, turning a community of citizens into a collection of desperate, isolated souls, all watching the world they knew burn away from the inside. The plague exposed how fragile civilization's rules could be, but other rules were carved into the very bedrock of Greek thought. Even the greatest philosophers, men who pondered justice, virtue, and the ideal state, provided intellectual cover for the system's most brutal institution. Aristotle, a towering figure whose logic shaped Western thinking for millennia, dedicated a significant portion of his work to a rational defense of slavery. He argued it was not merely a practical necessity, but a natural and just feature of a well-ordered society. His theory revolved around the concept of the natural slave. According to Aristotle, some people were born with souls lacking the full capacity for reason and self-direction. These individuals, he claimed, were biologically and intellectually suited only to follow orders, to provide the physical labor that would free the rational elite, the natural masters, to engage in politics, philosophy, and art. In his view, enslaving such a person was not an act of cruelty, but a benefit to them, providing the guidance their own minds could not. He even drew a chilling analogy, stating that the relationship between master and slave was as natural and necessary as that between the soul and the body, or between a man and his domesticated animals. This was not a fringe idea, it was a mainstream philosophical position from one of history's most influential minds. A deliberate intellectual project to frame human ownership as a cosmic and social good. Yet even in that era, dissenting voices dared to challenge this logic. A century before Aristotle, the sophists, itinerant teachers often criticized for their rhetorical trickery, posed a radical counter-argument. Thinkers like Alcidamas and the anonymous author known as the anonymous Iamblichi argued that no one was a slave by nature. They suggested that slavery was a convention, a man-made institution born from violence and conquest, not from any inherent human hierarchy. Freedom and servitude, they contended, were accidents of war, not destiny. These were dangerous ideas that threatened the entire economic and social foundation of the city-state, and they were largely marginalized by the philosophical establishment. This stark contrast reveals a profound and unsettling truth about the ancient world, and perhaps about humanity itself. The same culture that produced breathtaking inquiries into ethics and governance also produced elaborate, reasoned justifications for dehumanizing an entire class of people. Philosophy, the love of wisdom, was wielded not only to seek truth, but to sanctify the status quo, to build an unshakable intellectual fortress around a practice that required relentless psychological maintenance to sustain. It forces us to ask where the line is between understanding a society's beliefs and excusing them, and to recognize that the brilliance of an idea is no guarantee of its morality. These 25 glimpses into the shadows reveal a civilization of impossible contradiction. The very pillars of ancient Greece's immortal legacy were quarried from a bedrock of profound human hardship. Its luminous philosophy and democratic ideals were made possible by a system of slavery so complete it required a philosophical defense from Aristotle himself. The serene beauty of its art and architecture was financed by the labor of the silenced and the proceeds of conquest. The legendary discipline of its warriors was forged in the systematic terror of an entire subjugated people. This is not to diminish the achievements, but to understand their true cost. The brilliance was real, but it was not pure. It was a light that cast very long, very dark shadows. To study history honestly is to hold both the light and the shadow in our view at once, to acknowledge that human progress has rarely been a straight line from darkness into light, but a more tangled journey where enlightenment and brutality could exist side by side, often in the same city, the same mind, the same moment. The story of ancient Greece teaches us that a civilization's greatest triumphs and its deepest flaws are often woven from the same thread. So we leave you with a question as we pull back from these hidden layers. Which of these 25 facts shifted your perspective the most? Share your thoughts below. And if you are intrigued by history's complex truths, subscribe to join us as we continue to explore the unseen stories behind the world we think we know.